Here we go, The Boy Thief, chapter 6. Oh well, how exciting. Do come and have a cool drink with us, said Mrs. Walker. At the mention of fluid, Tom perked up again. I'm sure the girls would love to hear all about Australia. Do you have a governess over there? They all trooped out onto the lawn. A governess? Oh yes, Stella fixed another glare on Tom. Tom, his thoughts focused on cold drink, nodded solemnly. As they all helped Miss Walker move the rug and a pile of leather-bound books into the shade of the tree, Stella found herself glancing at the row of houses on the far side of the lawn. Is there something wrong? Said Sophie suddenly. Hey, that's our house, shouted Tom. What are you talking about? Said Sophie. That's our house. Stella laughed and quickly shook her head. Don't be silly, Tom. Our house is in Australia. She then clenched her teeth and gave poor Tom such a fierce look he thought he would burst into tears. So, Australia, Mrs. Walker smiled as she handed round glasses of fruit juice poured from a jug under the tree. What's it really like over there? Tom looked at the ground in bewilderment. Stella felt her cheeks start to burn again. Try as she might, all she could picture was the shape of Australia, which she knew resembled a dog's head. Well, she faltered. An image of the Sydney Opera House popped uninvited into her head, just as shouts came sailing across the lawn from the direction of the houses. They all looked up to see a man in a dark uniform and hat running towards them, closely followed by another man wearing rolled-up shirt sleeves and braces. A little farther behind came an elegant blonde-haired lady in a yellow skirt and a beautiful white blouse. You all right, miss? Wheezed the man in the uniform, looking all around. Miss Walker stood up in a fluster. Only there's been another theft. Crawley here saw a young ruffian in the garden, but he got away. Looks like he ran off with some silver. Mrs. Gladstone's coin purse is missing too. She's in a right state. The man called Crawley arrived panting. He immediately narrowed his dark eyes at Tom. A good beating, that's what he'll get when I catch him. Tom felt his stomach twist into a knot. Finally, the beautiful woman caught up. Sophie, Emma, thank goodness you're all right. Mama, shrieked Emma, jumping up with Sophie. Sophie and Emma's mother flung her arms around her two children, while Stella marveled at her flowing skirt and elaborate hair arrangement. The man in the dark uniform glanced down at Tom and Stella and then back at Miss Walker. It's the young lad we're after, about this one's age, he eyed Tom again. Tom swallowed hard and tried to look angelic. My goodness, who are these children, Miss Walker, said Mrs. Gladstone. Immediately she freed Sophie and Emma from her grasp. They're Lucy Culbertson's cousins from Australia, and I guessed first, said Emma triumphantly. She told me they might be coming. I didn't know it would be so soon. Well, I've never seen anything like it in my life, said Mrs. Gladstone, peering down her nose. If that's how they dress their children in Australia, then all I can say is, Look, I'm sorry to interrupt, ma'am, but if we want to catch this thief... Oh, yes, of course. Do carry on, Constable. The policeman, for what it was now obvious that this is what the man in the uniform was, knelt down. Now this is important, and especially for you nippers. He looked at each of the children in turn, as if trying to see inside their tiny minds. Did any of you here see a boy in the gardens last night? Looks kind of scruffy, tatty brown clothes? Tom leaned forward, about to say something. Then he felt Stella's sharp finger in his ribs. The children solemnly shook their heads in turn as the policeman counted round them again. Looks like you probably got away, he grumbled, standing up. Excuse me. Miss Gladstone gathered up her skirt and shot a cold glance at Miss Walker. Children, I'd like you inside, please, she said. I never did have much to say for studying in the garden, and we can't have you out here with a ruffian roaming the woods, can we? The children's faces dropped. so Stella noticed. Did Miss Walker's? Constable, I count on you to give the place a thorough search, twice over. Crawley, you go too. Yes, ma'am. Crawley bowed his head. The policeman delivered Mrs. Gladstone an icy smile, then headed off into the gardens with Crawley in his wake. Well now, what are you two waiting for? Snapped Mrs. Gladstone. Tom and Stella scrambled to their feet. Go on then, off you go now, back to Lucy's. And if I were you, I'd ask that mother of hers to lend you some half-decent clothes. You certainly can't be seen out in London dressed like that. Constance Gladstone then turned and marched off across the lawn with her children and their governess trotting behind like sorry puppies. Chapter 7, The Time Tunnelers. Ooh. The moment they were out of sight, Tom turned on Stella. Tears of frustration clouded his eyes. This is our house, he said crossly. Why did you go and say we live in Australia? I'm going to tell Mom. He lurched forward as quickly as Stella tugged him back. Tom, listen, she said firmly. You're forgetting something, aren't you? The lake, the hole we climbed down. Don't you see? Tom looked bewildered. Stella paused, trying to think of how to make him understand. She took in a deep breath. Tom, look, I do think that is our house. But, well, not at the moment. Look, don't ask me how, but that tunnel we found seems to have taken us back to our garden in a past time. That's why everyone's wearing those funny clothes. You're bonkers, said Tom. No, I'm not, said Stella. I think the boat you dug up in our garden came from this time. I think it's the one we rowed across the lake on today. Our garden must have had a lake that dried up. Tom, who had started chipping with his trowel at the bark of the tree, stopped what he was doing and slowly turned to Stella. Wow, he said brightly, his brown eyes almost doubled in size. We really are in the past. That's so cool. He gave his big sister the biggest grin. Stella, who was thinking what a fantastic adventure this was, put her arms around Tom and kissed his cheek. Come on, let's go home. We'll come back another time. Moments later, they were heading back through the woods toward the lake, sucking on fruit polos and laughing about the ladies' ridiculous long skirts. I wonder what happened to Harry, said Tom as they retraced their path. I wonder where that boy we saw is gone, said Stella. He must be the thief. And she sucked thoughtfully on her sweet. To Stella's relief, the little boat was still there when they emerged onto the lake bank. Tom sat opposite her, peering towards the far side through his binoculars as he rowed them back. He was starting to feel hungry, and they had their lunch boxes by the log up on the mound. You first, said Stella. They stood at the foot of the tree, and they had come down. Stella gave Tom a leg up, and he quickly grasped onto a nodule and started climbing. Stella followed him up into the shade of the vast branches. Where are you two going? They after you too? Bellowed a voice from below. Stella was so startled she nearly lost her footing. Clinging on tightly, she looked down to see the scruffy young boy staring up at her. Keep going, Tom, she called, glancing back up. It's the boy who stole the silver. They're coming for him. Immediately, Tom started climbing more quickly up through the dense branches above. Stella quickly followed. Higher and higher they went, all the time expecting the darkness to envelop them. But the tunnel didn't appear. All they could see was clear blue sky filtering through the last remaining branches above. Stella's heart sank. Tom, the tunnel's not here. We'd better go down, she called, trying not to sound scared. Thud. Stella landed beside the boy who was sitting with his back up against the side of the tree. Thud. Down came Tom, binoculars, trowel, and all. So, said the boy, smiling, looks like we're all in trouble. He paused briefly as he looked them up and down, and then he pulled the funniest of faces. What are them outfits you're wearing? Are you from a circus or what? We're not in any trouble, thanks. You are, said Stella sharply. She didn't trust this thief one little bit, and she clung tightly to her iPhone in case he tried to steal it. I'm hungry, said Tom. I wish we'd brought our lunch boxes, Stella. There you go, lad. The boy reached into a paper bag beside him and held out a huge hunk of white bread. How do we know that's not poisonous, said Stella. You are a thief, after all. They told us all about you in the garden. The boy sighed. I never stole nothing. Yes, you did, said Stella. You took some silver. It's lucky they didn't arrest you. The boy slowly shook his head. It ain't true, he said wearily. Stella frowned at him suspiciously. Look, sit down, will ya, and let that boy have something to eat. There's loads here, and we ain't going nowhere till the sun goes down. I'm Jack, by the way. Nice to meet you. Despite what she'd heard, Stella couldn't help liking Jack after all. He had a warm smile and friendly brown eyes, and most importantly, he seemed concerned about Tom. Soon they were all chewing on the soft white bread and listening to the chatter of the birds in the trees. So why do they say you stole something if you didn't? Asked Stella. Jack shook his head slowly and then started to explain. He said his father, Jacob, had been one of the builders of the houses in the garden. And afterwards he did regular building work for the Gladstones and the other houses in the garden. How one day, after some silver went missing in the house, he was falsely accused of stealing by one of the servants, and he was sent to jail. How he was now free, but was a broken man with no one to recommend him, and without any of his work tools, which he kept in the Gladstone cellar. Finally, how he, Jack, had snuck into the house to try to retrieve his father's tools to help him. Pa lives for work, said Jack, and without it, I don't think he'll go on much longer. He'll die of a broken mind or else hunger, that's for sure. And if that ain't what we'll all end up with in the workhouse, and I wouldn't wish that on anyone. The children sat in silence. Stella held her knees and stared at the ground. She felt terrible for having called Jack a thief. Anyways, Jack went on, that's when I sees Crawley stealing silver from the Gladstones. Tom frowned suspiciously. That horrid man we met in the garden? You saw Crawley take the silver? Asked Stella. Sure as I can be, said Jack. See, I'd snuck in through the kitchen, through the garden door, to get to the cellar, and I heard someone coming. So I slipped in the back stairs, and immediately I spotted Crawley, acting funny, coming from one of the rooms. Looked like he was carrying something under his jacket. He never saw me, but he disappeared right quick down to the garden. I saw him with my own eyes from the balcony window up there. Jack described how he'd gone to look for Crawley in the garden, and how within minutes half the household was chasing across the garden, calling him a thief. How did you manage to escape? Asked Tom, his eyes widening. Jack started to smile. Well, there's the story. I was running toward the trees when all of a sudden I saw these moles my pa told me about. And I swear it was just like that moment when them folks stopped chasing me. They thought they'd lost me, but I weren't that far ahead. That's why I decided to row over, just to be on the safe side. Moles? What do moles have to do with anything? Said Stella, frowning. I'm not sure, said Jack, but I knows they special. He sat up straight and smiled proudly. It was Pa who discovered him on the first day they set to preparing land for building. Whole place was shrouded in mist. Then out of the blue, he sees these moles scuttling in a circle, not 50 feet away, near a group of trees. Tom and Stella stared at Jack in astonishment. Jack went on. Of course, when Pa told everyone else, they all said he was mad. Moles don't come out in the daylight, and they certainly don't run around in circles either. Everyone made a joke of it, but we knew they meant something special. Carried on seeing them right up to when Gladstone threw them out. Jack, I've seen the moles too, said Stella excitedly. I saw them through Tom's binoculars when we came down the tree. I thought I was imagining it. And I saw them in our garden when we first went looking for Harry, chipped in Tom. And just before we found the tunnel. I thought I was dreaming, Stella. Jack looked confused. Your garden? A tunnel? What are you talking about? Stella hesitated for a moment and then took a deep breath. She somehow knew that she could trust Jack. It's a bit hard to explain, Jack, she said, and I don't really understand what's happened. But well, you see, Tom and I, we're not from this time. We're from a time in the future, the next century, actually, and we live in the Gladstones' house there. Jack opened his mouth to say something, but the words carried on tumbling out of Stella's. Oh, except that it's one house, not one house anymore. It's been divided into flats. And we live on the lower ground and raised ground floors. And we do still have the same shared gardens, minus this lake. That is, it's all dried up in our time. She gave Jack a very broad grin, hoping it would help ease the shock. You're kidding me, or what? Said Jack with a look of disbelief. Stella's telling the truth, said Tom eagerly. And when we were looking for our neighbor's dog, we found a tunnel with a ladder that brought us here. And just before that, I saw some moles. Jack sat, shaking his head. Hey, I wonder if the moles make the tunnel appear, said Stella suddenly. Actually, that makes sense, doesn't it? Moles, tunnel, holes, don't they? Your father must be right, Jack. They are special. Jeepers, said Jack, smiling and shaking his head. Ain't nothing gonna surprise me anymore about this. Nippers traveling back through a time tunnel and all. Can't wait to see your pa's face my pa's face when I tell him this. Tom was beaming from ear to ear, but Stella was suddenly looking serious. She shifted awkwardly where she sat. There's one slight problem, though, she said. The tunnels disappeared. That's why we came back down. She pushed her hair behind her ears and studied her feet. I suppose we'll just have to wait for the moles to appear again to make it come back, don't you think? In fact, Stella was terrified that the moles would never return and that she and Tom would be stuck in the past forever. But she wasn't going to let on. Must be, said Jack quickly, must be. He seemed to sense her fear. And seeing the moles looked after me, I'm sure they'll look after you too. Anyways, I'll wait with you both till they come. I ain't going back over there in no hurry. Stella, relieved, began smiling. Jack leaned towards her, peering at her iPhone. So while we're waiting, what's that thing hanging out of your pocket? Here, try it. Stella switched on some music and passed it over. As she placed the earphones into Jack's ears, his smudged brown face expanded with delight. Jeepers, he shouted. You got people in there or what? How do you do that then? His eyes grew wider and wider in disbelief as his mouth fell wide open, and as the sun finally set behind the trees, Stella and Tom fell about in fits of laughter. The end of the chapter 7. We're now on chapter 8, a moonlight raid.